like if you read it every time, then you read it every time. So.
And then when you go to a new church, you don't know if they say, trespasses
right.
or
Yeah.
It's always an interesting thing. So we're going to look at Esther. This is our 10th week, and we're combining chapters 9 and 10. 10 is only 3 verses long, so I figured we're not going to spend an entire week on 3. We probably could, but we're not going to. We're going to do the same thing we did last week. I'll read a verse, and then the next verse, and the next verse, and the next verse. If you don't want to read, that's perfectly fine. We're not pushing or judging anybody who doesn't read. And we'll work through chapter 9 and 10.
Just have to hold it close.
Alright. It's chapter 9. The Jews destroy their enemies. Now in the 12th month, which is in the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. Go ahead, that's all right. That's okay. Go ahead.
The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them had fallen upon all the peoples.
In fact, in all the provincial officials, governors, administrators, royal representatives helped the Jews because they were all afraid of Mordecai.
And Mordecai was a mighty name in the king's palace, and his fame was known throughout all the provinces, for he had become more and more powerful.
So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them.
In Susa, the capital itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Paradashatha and Dalphon and Aphtha.
Where were you?
Verse 8.
Verse 8.
It's like 3 words.
My hand runs together.
Yeah, you some bad names there. That's right, go ahead.
We'll skip those ones. Skip the names.
Just go ahead and skip them, call them all Dave. That's what that does.
I give them their names.
Yeah. Going down to verse 10.
See, there's no 10 in my book. It's 7 to 10 is all together, and they're all names.
Mm-hmm.
And then 11 is another 10.
Minus too much of that.
For me, verse 10 says, the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Amethiah, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not take any plunder.
Yeah, we'll keep on from verse 11 then. That very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the capital, was reported to the king. Go ahead, yeah, that's fine.
On that day, the number of those who were slain in Susan, the capital, was brought before the king.
Verse 1.
Oh, okay. He then said to Queen Esther, in Susa alone, the Jews have killed 500 men, including Haman's 10 sons. What must they have done out in the provinces? What do you want now? You shall have it. Tell me what else you want, and you shall have it.
And Esther said, if it please your majesty, let the Jews who are here in Susa do again tomorrow as they have done today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows.
So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons.
The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder.
Now the other Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and gained relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. But they lay no hands on the plunder.
This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness.
The Jews of Susa, however, made the 15th a holiday, since they had slaughtered their enemies on the 13th and 14th, and had stopped on the 15th.
And so it is that the Jews in the unwalled villages throughout Israel to this day have an unusual celebration on the second day, and they rejoice and send gifts to each other.
Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far, throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes,
obligating them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year.
As the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow unto gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and present presents to the poor.
So the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written to them.
Haman, son of Hamediah, the descendants of Aga and the enemy of the Jewish people, had cast lots to determine the day for destroying the Jews. He had planned to wipe them out.
It all comes together. Okay. Okay. Just pick up here somewhere. The plot to destroy them at the time was determined by the throw of the dice, and to remind them that when the matter came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's plot to boomerang, and he and his sons were hanged on the gallows.
That is why this celebration called Purim, because it is the ancient word for casting lots. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced,
The Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and at the same time appointed at every year.
These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every family, province, and city. And these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants.
Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai to do, gave full power, confirming the second letter of Purim.
The letter was addressed to all the Jews, and copies were sent to all 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. It wished the Jews peace and security. It's in the middle of the sentence, Amanda.
Yeah. Okay, Jews wrote the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Asher with messages of goodwill and encouragement to confirm these 2 days annually as the Feast of Purim, decreed by both Mordecai the Jew and by Queen Esther. Indeed, the Jews themselves have decided upon this tradition as a remembrance of the times of their national fasting and prayer.
so the command of Esther confirmed the practice of Purim, and it was all written down in the records.
Chapter 10, the greatness of Mordecai. King Xerxes imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea.
All the acts of his power and might, and the full amount of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, Are they not written in the annals of the king of, I don't know what that name is, Media and Persia?
For Mordecai the Jew was next to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and was a favorite with the multitude of his brethren, for he sought the welfare of his people, and spoke peace to his whole race.
May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. And I think he was the only one who's pronounced King Xerxes' alternate name the right way.
What was it?
Want to say it again?
Ahasuerus.
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 Yeah. I always just switched it to Xerxes because
Yeah.
it's easier to say. So let's look at these two chapters. Like I said, chapter 10 kind of serves as like an epilogue to the end of the book of Esther. It's kind of like when you're watching a TV show and there's the series finale and then you get that like 10-minute little add-on with all of the characters a little bit older, you know, kind of figuring out where they were in life and all that. I think Friends did that or something, didn't it? A lot of TV shows do that little tack on, and that's kind of what chapter 10 is. It's just saying what happened after the events of Esther.
The Waltons do that.
Was it?
The Waltons.
Okay, yeah. So we aren't in Veggie Tales anymore. A lot of our teaching in the scripture kind of go up to a certain point, and then we kind of ignore the details that are a little bit more bloody and hard to deal with. Esther is kind of like that. A lot of times in Sunday school, and even in sermons and stuff like that, they'll go up to the defeat of Haman. Sometimes they won't even go into Haman being executed. And that's where the story ends. It's all happy and good after that. But as we've been kind of looking through this, that's really not how Esther ends. Esther has a little bit more of a bloody end to it. Of course, we see over 75,000 people die in the countryside, and then another 700 people die within the capital of Susa alone. But one of the things that we have to remember, though, is that this was the only way that they could kind of counter the law that Haman had put in place. We already saw that when a law was signed with the king's signet, it can't be undone, not even by the king himself. So Esther and Mordecai had to come up with an alternate. And their alternate was self-defense, essentially. It allowed the Jews to take up arms and not go out and attack and pillage whoever they wanted, but only to defend themselves from who was attacking them. And of course we see, according to the book of Esther, this is quite a large number of people who were trying to get after the Jews. If you remember Haman's original law, it specified that you could go and kill the Jews and then just take whatever they owned. So the people were essentially raiding and trying to plunder the Jews. And one of the key things we'll talk about later is that the Jews did the opposite of that a little bit. So we have to remember that though Veggie Tales and stuff like that is helpful, history is often a little bit more bloody and a little bit more inconvenient than what we'd like it to be. And that's not to say Veggie Tales isn't important. When we're looking at these stories, especially when teaching them to kids, you know, sometimes it's helpful to perhaps water down some of the details a little bit. I think, if I remember correctly, in the story of Esther in Veggie Tales, they end up tickling Haman with a feather or something like that. It's a little bit more tame than what actually happens. But it's important that we realize once we've gotten to a faith that can accept these kind of details, that we do look at them because they are important. It shows a side of history that well, it shows how it was. It shows God's true providence even in the times of bloody conflict. So let's talk about the slaughter itself a little bit. We see 75,700 total dead, all in self-defense. Or at least that's what we read in the book. We don't read of any Jews that were actively going out and killing people just for the fun of it, or even going out and plundering. Without looking at the slides, because I didn't set it up so that each text comes up when they click it. What's repeated, oftentimes, it's repeated 3 times in this passage. Any guesses?
That they took nothing.
There was no plunder taken at all. And this is an important detail because Haman's original law was that, of course, you could go kill them and take everything that they own. But the Jews, in response to this, either through thinking that, we're going to try and be as holy as possible through this, or in reference to some of the Old Testament stories, or Older Testament stories, which we'll kind of get into in a minute, they didn't take any plunder at all. It was purely an act of self-defense. If we look back into the stories of 1st and 2nd Samuel, when King Saul, the first king of Israel, comes into it, his downfall is when he goes into battle, takes a bunch of plunder, and it's not the taking of plunder that's the bad thing, because he was ordered to take the plunder and bring it back to the temple. That he was ordered to bring it back as an offering to God. But what he does is he goes, takes all the gold and stuff like that, brings that to the temple, then he keeps a bunch of the livestock and stuff like that for himself. And there's this ongoing repetition a bunch of times in the Old Testament where somebody will do an action and then they'll keep a little bit of it for themselves. And this is constantly demonstrated by God to be something that he doesn't want. If you're going to do something for him, he wants 110% of it to be for him and not for yourself. So one of the ways of reading this is saying, maybe the Jews, in reference to these old stories that they would have grown up on, are saying, it's good enough that we survive, let's keep it at that. We don't want to take this any further than it needs to go. And of course, this also meant that for some of the families who had members of their family killed, it means that they weren't poor and destitute afterwards. There's a certain amount of merciness to the Jewish retaliation in this. And then, of course, we also see that Esther has to draft a second law, allowing the Jews to defend themselves a second day. And a lot of times when we read this, we say, well, why would they have to do that? Haman's law originally laid it out that this would happen over the course of a couple of weeks. And Esther's retaliation for this in the capital of Susa is saying the Jews need more time. They need to be able to defend themselves longer. And we don't really know what happened out in the countryside. Maybe perhaps the 75,000 that was enough to deter perhaps the people who were originally attacking. But it's one of the parts in the Bible that's graphic, and it's perhaps hard for us to swallow. But we have to remember that this is the context of their times. They lived in a brutal period, especially when we start talking about Haman's sons that were slaughtered. What did this have to do with anything? Why were they drafted in the law just to be executed? And there's a couple of readings of that, which we'll get into a little bit later. Any questions or thoughts so far? Robert has a quizzical look on her face.
Yeah. In most times when one nation was taking over the other, they killed the family of the leader so that they wouldn't rise up another army against them.
Yeah, it was a way of ensuring that you were the leader, that there wasn't any sons or family members that could claim, I'm from this line, so it's my duty to overthrow the current government. We actually see this in the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, when Rome comes in and conquers Israel. There's a group of families called the Maccabees, which we read about in the Apocrypha actually, where I can't remember which Roman emperor it was, but he comes in and conquers them, and then he purposefully goes through and kills every member of the Maccabees. Because originally the Maccabees led this great rebellion, which is where we get the Zealots from the New Testament from. But it was such an issue that the emperor came in and just said, we're not having any of you guys anymore. You've caused too much trouble, we're wiping you all out. So it's cruel. But this was just a facet of life back then. It wasn't a particularly fun one, especially
Is
for
that why they killed the 10 sons of Haman?
Yeah, that's probably why they killed the 10 sons of Haman. If you read it, if you noticed it, they were hung on the same gallows that Haman was also hung on.
Built. He
Yeah.
built. Didn't he build that?
Yeah, and he built that. So the pride that killed him also ended up killing his family. So when I was reading through some commentaries on this, of course, a lot of commentaries try to take a little bit of a skeptical look at some of the numbers. Some of the stuff that we read in the Bible, a lot of people will say, that's a pretty exact number. Was that really how many people died, or was that really what happened? So, in reading some commentaries, some people say that the numbers might be exaggerated. The Jews couldn't have killed that many people, or there couldn't have been that many enemies of the Jews. What do we think of this? How do we read this?
Unless they went around and counted the bodies, I don't know exactly. But they would have some idea to estimate
Yeah.
the numbers.
I think it's interesting that it says that the Jews killed 75,500, whether.
Yeah.
There's no mention about if any Jews were killed.
That's a good point. That's a good point to bring up. Any other thoughts? So, one of the main resource I used for this was the Oxford Bible Commentary. And I think it's one of the ones that's pretty short and to the point. I like it. But one of the things it brings up is, the Jews can't possibly have this many enemies in the entire Empire of Persia. But one of the things that we have to realize too is that, Haman didn't just draft this up specifically for the enemies of the Jews. He drafted this up as an act for people who were poor and destitute, saying, hey, we could get rich pretty quick if we go over and take over this Jewish person's mansion or villa kind of thing. So there's a bit more politics involved into it than that. For a lot of people, this would have been a money-making scheme to get rid of the Jews and take all that they own. And of course, we also see that, it's like Eva pointed to it too. 75,000 probably isn't the exact number, but it's a pretty good rough estimate that we probably would have seen. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind too is that the Empire of Persia is absolutely massive. It stretched all the way from Africa and Egypt all the way to towards Russia and China. Like, it was the biggest empire at the time. The next biggest one would have been Alexander the Great's empire that stretched even further than that. So of course we see, 75,000 is a lot, but compared to the entire empire, probably not so much. Then it also brings into question, well, how many Jews were actually in the empire at the time? We can't actually say that for sure. We're not 100% sure. But what we do know is the Babylonian Empire beforehand culled all of the smartest and best and fittest Israelites out of Israel and brought them into the empire to try and make themselves a better empire. So, and because of that, we see a lot of Jews that were rising through the ranks, like Daniel. He became one of the higher politicians and stuff like that. We see Esther becoming the second in command. We see a lot of Jews becoming rich and important people within the Babylonian and Persian empires, which probably meant that they had a bunch of kids and they had a bunch of wives, and their population would have grown before they came back to Israel. So, on first glance, it might look a little fishy. On deeper reading, perhaps a little bit not so much. Commentators are quick to point out, well, it couldn't have been that. That's too many. Jesus couldn't have survived for 40 days without food. That's impossible. Yeah, if you look at some of the science and the statistics and stuff like that, it is possible. We just have to take on faith that what the Bible said is true. So it's like the Feast of Purim. This is one of the Jews' most important feasts. This is a commemoration of the events of the Jews being saved. It's kind of like how we get Christmas and stuff like that. And I write down Purim, like communion, is a memory of a past event or a memorial, something that we share with our Jewish brothers and sisters. We do the same thing. Something will happen in the past and we'll commemorate it with events or celebrations like birthdays or anniversaries. It's the same. An important event happens and then we celebrate it annually kind of thing. Everything comes from somewhere. So you guys know where Christmas comes from? Other than, Jesus' birth, where we get the celebration of the event from. What was that?
A lot of Christmas things are pagan celebrations.
Yeah, so when a lot of missionaries were going up through Celtic lands, preaching to the Germans, the Irishmen, the Welsh, and stuff like that, they noticed that at winter solstice, which would have been around Christmas time, or our Christmas time, was one of their most important pagan festivals. And Of course, a lot of those pagan festivals would feature human sacrifice and other grotesque and awful things. So one of the things that the missionaries wanted to do was they wanted to say, how do we incorporate their yearly schedule so that it's not, we're not saying we're getting rid of your culture completely by bringing in Christianity. How do we incorporate this into us a little bit? And so what we get is the inauguration of Christmas around the winter solstice. And it was done so that the pagans would have a little bit of familiarity with it. They would say, oh, this is something that we've been doing, but just with a little bit of a different flavor, less human sacrifice and more celebrating the infant baby Jesus. So we get these events that come out of something else. So for the Jews, the Feast of Purim comes out of the attempted genocide of the Jews and the celebration that they weren't genocided. What else does this feast remind you of? If we look back further in our Old Testaments. Can you think of another important Jewish festival?
I'm thinking of Easter and Passover.
The Passover. Passover is the biggest one, and that's the celebration of the Jews and the Israelites being saved from slavery in Egypt. And it's kind of the same thing. After each time that the Jews come out of something bloody and they realize that God was the only thing that could have brought them out of it, they mark it with a celebration. In the same way, we do stuff like Christmas and Easter. Was Jesus actually born on December 25th? Probably not. A lot of people speculate it was actually closer to March. But it doesn't really matter what day, it doesn't have to be specifically the day that Jesus was born that you celebrate it on. It's the celebration itself that's important. Of course, as we're coming into the Easter season, do we think that Jesus actually died on Good Friday? Some people say yes, some people say no. But it's important that we keep the celebration no matter what. It doesn't matter. If we celebrated the event to the minute of when Jesus died. That's not the important part. It's the marking of the event itself that's important. Of course, we also see that festivals tend to turn war into peace and sorrow into gladness, which is one of the verses from this reading, where a festival has this ability to be able to turn sorrow, or the Jews being killed, into gladness, the thankfulness for having survived this. We see similar things with things like Remembrance Day. It's a sorrowful reminder of what happened, but at the end we're glad because of that sacrifice that we're able to be free. Festivals have that ability that even if something bad happens, there's something good that comes out of it. A lot of funerals turn out like that too. So at the end, is everybody happy? What do we think? All the main characters, are they all content with how things turned out?
The Jewish side.
Yeah, the Jews would have been pretty happy about this. What else?
Those that are alive are probably happy.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
So the king seems pleased. He gets rid of Haman's family immediately, which means that he wouldn't have had a whole lot of political dissonance to deal with. Of course, we see that doesn't really help him. The Persian Empire crumbles pretty soon afterwards. Anyway, I think it's with the next emperor that it crumbles. Esther's happy, her people are saved, and she remains the queen of the Empire of Persia. Mordecai is happy, and he's the second in command. He takes Haman's position. But what happens from here? Where does the empire go? What happens to the Jews? Does everything end happy afterwards? Do we know what happens right after the story of Esther? I was going to say the next book is not helpful.
They're always going in and out of conflict, messing up. So it's like us.
Exactly. Yeah, there's all through the Old Testament we see this pattern of the Jews falling away, and then God bringing them up out of the dirt, raising them up again. And then there's a period of peace and happiness and prosperity. And then they start thinking, oh, it wasn't God who did that, it was this brass idol who did that. So we're going to start worshiping this instead. And then, of course, we see that they start to get dragged through the mud again. And we kind of see that with ourselves too. We go through periods where we're really faithful, where we are really on top of things. And then we see periods where, we tend to get dragged through the mud a little bit. We don't always tend to do what we know we should do. Paul is famous for saying, I constantly do the things I know I shouldn't do, and I constantly don't do the things I know I should do. And that's kind of the story of the Israelites here. Shortly after this, and shortly means a couple centuries, the Jews would get to go back to Israel again. Emperor Cyrus would allow them to go back into Israel again. And then we see Ezra and Nehemiah recounting the events of rebuilding the walls in the city of Jerusalem, and slowly but surely building the nation back, not to what it was, but building it back up again. So, where is God in all this? I've always asked this question and answered it through this Bible study. Where do you guys think God is in this, without reading the PowerPoint?
Read it anyway.
Yeah.
I can't see that.
Yeah.
I can hardly see Ruth, yeah.
I have a CD on my calendar, running through quite a bit, and then one song says, God is watching us.
Mm-hmm.
He's always there.
And he always knows what we're up to. And not in a negative way, like Santa checking in to see if you're naughty or nice, but he's always there. It's more of a loving watch, keeping watch on us.
I think he must have helped.
The Jews prevailed, so therefore he probably had a hand in that and making sure
Your dad, to from white, I mean, you could have completely gone the other way.
Exactly. It could have been, like you said, completely the opposite. And to kind of go back to what you said earlier too, that there's no accounting of how many Jews died in all of this. The importance for the writer of Esther isn't that, it's not that how many Jews died. It's how they were able to conquer the people who were trying to conquer them. And that's part of the reason why I think that the number of Jews isn't listed there, because that's not the point of the book. It's not trying to say they were almost genocided, but then everything was good, but this amount of people died. It was trying to put in emphasis that they were there was an attempted genocide on them, and they conquered the people that they were trying to conquer. It's trying to end on a triumphant, happy note. That's why we don't know how many Jews died in all of this. In the middle of it, it was probably a lot more somber and probably a little bit more depressing than what the book of Esther makes it out to be. But that's part of history, right? So I write down that our origins come from this. Even if we don't look at their festivals as ours, it's still important that we realize what they are and where they came from. A lot of times as Christians, we kind of disassociate ourselves from the Jewish side of things, even though the Jewish side of things is really where we came from. When the early church was first coming about, and shortly after Jesus had died, around the 70s and 80s, not 1970 and 80, around year 70, we see that a lot of people view early Christianity as actually a sect of Judaism. A lot of people were thinking that these Christians were actually just Jews with a different flavor on top. We might see this as, one of our churches splintering off and making a new denomination. They're still Christian, but there's a different flavor to them. So originally, a lot of people view Christians as a form of Jews. And of course, we see through history that gets disassociated quite a bit. We see some fighting going on between Christians and Jews. We see some splintering off and stuff like that. But when we're looking through the text and stuff like that, there's a reason why our Bible has the Old Testament in it. And one of the reasons is to see how God works with people throughout history. But the other reason is so that we realize where we get our roots from. It's important that we realize that, Christianity didn't just, start becoming a thing when Jesus died. There was a process to it. Just like our Bible. Our Bible wasn't just one day the Bible. There was countless centuries where it was being formed, where it was being, where they were discussing, should this book be a part of the Bible or not? That's where we get the Apocrypha from and stuff like that. So in this, it's important that we develop and explore our own festivals or moments of thanksgiving, and that we should give them to God. So what I mean by this is that, Christmas and Easter, of course, are important liturgical times of year. But as we're going through the process of life, all of us come up with anniversaries for different things, whether that be marriages, or birthdays, or deaths, or an important event happening, the creation of something. All of these things are important because they remind us of God. And that's the important thing that we need to remember as Christians, that birthdays and anniversaries, they're good, but we have to remember that it's through God that those things were even allowed to exist. Of course, Christmas and Easter are the easy ones for this, because we're forced to look at the Christian point of view of it. But in a lot of our other festivals, it's sometimes easily forgotten how close God is in all of this. It's easy to disassociate the festival itself from God, if that makes any sense.
And Santa Claus.
Yeah.
Being so important.
As a little bit of a tangent, do we know where we get Santa Claus from?
St. Nicholas.
Yeah. St. Nicholas, he was famous for throwing his family's fortune down the chimney for wedding dowries for people who couldn't afford to get married. He died a penniless pauper. He was also a bit of a theologian too. He was really important. I believe it's on the Council of Worms, where they were talking about, I can't remember, they were talking about some heresy that was springing up in the early church. He's very famous for punching the heretic. He was very famous for, in the middle of the council, just decking the guy on the ground. Interesting Christ history. It's perhaps a part of Santa Claus that even though he's more about. So as we begin to close down, where do we want to move from here? I think we have enough people to vote on where we want to go next.
Before we do that, I was thinking, talking a little bit of celebrations. In Genesis, it speaks of Christ coming and stepping on the serpent and so on. And all those years that God was working with his people, and they were waiting for Messiah.
Yeah.
And thinking, oh, wow.
Yeah, it took centuries and centuries and centuries. And the sad part is that there's still Jews who are waiting for the Messiah. That's modern Judaism is perhaps a little bit different from the Judaism that we read in the Bible. But that waiting for the Savior is still there. Of course, we know that the Savior came with Jesus, and that's an important celebration for us. But it's one that modern day Jews are missing out on. They're kind of, people will say our Catholic brothers and sisters, we're not Orthodox, but they are kind of think, we're still Christians. The Jews almost seem like a cousin to us. They're halfway there, if that makes any sense.
I like it when you see a movie and the Jewish customs will come in at Christmas time.
Yeah.
So things like that. I'm sure I know it's a movie, but
Yeah.
The Jews, they see Jesus as a Messiah, as a prophet.
Yeah.
Versus a Messiah.
A lot of modern day Jews would either argue that Jesus was simply a very good man, or that he was a prophet who turned into a heretic at the end. Most modern day Jews are still waiting for the Messiah to come. I think I brought it up last week, I believe. But the concept of Messiah is not just Jesus in the Old Testament either. When we read about Isaiah talking about the Messiah, it can also be read that he's referring to Emperor Cyrus, who allows the Jews to come back home. And in fact, there's some language used in the book of Isaiah that infers that he is a form of Messiah. But of course, we see that Jesus, at the end of the day, is the true Messiah. Cyrus fulfilled the prophecy in one aspect, but Jesus fulfilled it in a much older aspect to it. So, any other questions before we move on?
Still in this time where we're going.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. So, you had kind of brought up the idea of looking through Ruth next, which is easy. It's only 4 chapters long. We could do that before the summer starts. We could also look at specific questions and answers kind of thing. I know there's a lot of questions about specific parts of the Bible, like does the book of Revelation actually tell us what day the apocalypse is going to start? There's a bit more nuance to it. Yeah, would we even want to know it?
Yeah.
So, and also we have the question of do we want to continue on during the summer? I'm more than willing to, but I know some people aren't necessarily couldn't be here for it and stuff like that. So, got a shaking of heads. I don't think we'll have it during the summer. But would we want to look at Ruth next, or would we want to look at more of a question of the week kind of thing as we go into the summer? We'll probably have our last one in either the last week of May or the last week of June before we get the summer.
Everybody starts vacation on the Victoria Day weekend.
I'll keep
Go to
that.
the cottage, you know.
Yeah, we'll probably end it on that weekend, or the weekend before that, maybe. What do we think?
Well, I just think that, with springtime, it's just that there's so many things to do. And I know that we're probably all retired, but still, we're old too and slower.
I was just saying, retired doesn't mean not busy.
Yeah. But, I'm hoping there's going to be a little stage in there where I probably won't be coming to anything, so.
Yeah.
Well, if we did Ruth, would we do it like every 2 weeks instead of every week?
Maybe we do that
Everyone?
Every 2 weeks.
every week.
If we did Ruth, it's only 4 structure. It's just gonna, it's dangerous to give everybody an extra Saturday morning to go do whatever.
Alrighty. Those in favor?
Like last week, I'm not here.
Yeah, that's all
Going
good.
straight to the TV, or the computer, or whatever you call it.
Alright, well,
Sorry. That's fine.
we'll look at the Book of Ruth standard every other week then. And then once we're done that, we'll take a break for the summer and then we'll probably pick a bit of a larger book to start shooting on come fall and winter. What was that?
Is that still on?
Yeah, it is. I can stop it if you want me to. Yep.